Good evening. This evening we're going to be looking at Philippians chapter 4, where as Paul brings his letter to the Philippians to a close, he shares with us some very important, what I'm going to call, antidotes to anxiety. They're joy robbers. The first antidote that I would like for you to notice with me is found in his discussion in verses 4 through 7. In verse 4, he's going to tell us to rejoice in the Lord. Again, I say, rejoice. And then he immediately follows that up in verse 6 by talking about how we need to pray to God with thanksgiving in our hearts. And if we do so, he tells us in verse 7, we'll find the peace of God that passes understanding in our lives. And so I want to suggest, first of all, that the first antidote to anxiety is prayer. Through the years, my long-suffering wife has listened to me whine and moan and groan, I'm sure by now literally for thousands of hours. She's been such a blessing to me as we would walk and I would talk and she would listen and I would get frustrations and worries and concerns out and aired, and it makes you feel better. It just does, and I thank God for her listening to me like that. But talking to God has also been an incredible blessing. When I'm walking in the auditorium, when I'm walking outside, when I'm sitting in the car and driving, I'll spend a lot of time talking to God and sharing with Him my concerns and cares and anxieties. And there's tremendous peace to be found in that. Not just in verbalizing these things, but in knowing that I'm talking to the one who can do something about them. A wonderful antidote to anxiety is prayer. And I would urge you, when you're concerned and when you care, to cast all your cares upon Him, as Peter will urge us, and pray to God. Secondly, Paul will say that it's so important that we focus on the positive in our lives as an antidote to anxiety. Listen to what he says in verse 8. Finally, brothers, whatever's true, whatever's honorable, whatever's just, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. We live, let's be honest, we live in a really negative world. Increasingly, you see a word that's tossed around quite a bit now, a dystopian view of the future. Dystopian being the opposite of utopian. A utopian view of the future is a positive, optimistic view of the future, and a dystopian view of the future is the very opposite of that. It's a very negative, pessimistic view of the future. And as you look at so many of the movies and books and just general attitudes about things today, it's dystopian, it's hopeless, the future is bleak and dark. And it's not. Oh, I mean, it can be, if that's what you choose to focus on and center your mind on. And I really believe that's one of the reasons why so many people today are running to drugs, because they're wanting to escape from this negative, hopeless view of the future. But Paul says it doesn't have to be that way. Think about positive things. Focus on positive things. And there's a lot of positive in this world, brothers and sisters. There's a lot of blessings that are ours. There are a lot of opportunities to watch good movies, to read good books, to surround ourselves with positive people. And it's amazing how that affects your attitude. If we focus on the positive, it's so much easier to see the world in a positive light. And so The anxiety that surrounds so many today and fills their hearts and their minds and drags them down has to do with what they fill their minds with. They fill their minds with what's negative, and all that can come from that's negative. Paul challenges us as Christians to do just the opposite, to fill our minds with that which is positive. And then thirdly, on down in verse 11, he says something very important. He says, I have learned in whatever state I am, therein to be content. He'll say, I know how to be abased, I know how to abound, and he did. But it's something he says that he had learned. How do you sit in a prison cell and say, well, I'm content? It's because you've learned that like joy, contentment is not dictated by circumstances, and it's not. Christian joy is not dictated by circumstances. It rises above circumstances. And I would argue that contentment's the same way. Contentment is not dictated by circumstances. Contentment rises above circumstances. Contentment is an attitude. It's a wholesome, healthy, godly perspective on life. 30 years ago, maybe a little better, I was blessed to know a widow while I was living in Portales, who lived in a little bitty house off on a side street. She didn't have much money. She had 3 daughters, all of whom had died of cancer. If there was ever anybody who had a quote-unquote right to be negative and right to be bitter, I would think it would be someone like her. And she was the very opposite. She was one of the most positive, optimistic, sweet, contented people that you'd ever meet, that I've ever been blessed to know. And I learned from her, because her attitude was the attitude of Job, really. I came into this life with nothing. I'm going to leave with nothing. Whatever I have, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Remember the words of Job? Blessed be the name of the Lord. That was her attitude. And in that attitude of a learned contentment, I saw a beautiful freedom that so many people don't enjoy. Because you see, if you live your life in discontent, you're never really going to be free to enjoy this life. There's always going to be that scab that you have to scratch at that robs you of your joy because of that lack of contentment. And if we'll learn, as Paul did, and I do believe you learn to be content, there's such a blessing there. Such a wonderful, optimistic way to be able to view life that will never be yours otherwise. And so, 3 antidotes to anxiety. Number 1, be sure, as Paul says, to pray. Number 2, focus on the positive. And number 3, genuinely set your mind toward learning to be content. It'll bless your life. It'll bless the lives of others. I pray God will bless your discussion this evening. God bless.
In every life we have some trouble, but when you worry you make it double. Don't worry, be happy. Don't worry, be happy now.